Now you are going to do an activity today, students. Shh, focus, and maybe turn around and look at me. I'm feeling unappreciated. So this is the second question, and it's whereas the first question had that discriminator. That's what we call something we look for to make sure that it has to be in your essay so that you can get the B's and the A's. Its discriminator was the concept of inspiring or unsettling. And if you didn't have that, you weren't going to be able to do very well in that question. This one has a different discriminator. It looks like an easier question, and in some ways it's the same question. It's not that different, but it's got a tricky bit. So let's read it and see if you can get it. Discuss how your response to values and attitudes in at least one text reflects a cultural and contemporary context. Do you know what the trick is?
So that it's cultural and contemporary context?
Certainly that is, but that's not the trick. There's a trick. There's something that if you don't do it, you aren't answering.
You have to link the culture and contemporary view back to your own attitudes and values?
You got the you. Yeah, that's it. It's the your. This is a first person. I, we, our, mine. Now I should make something very clear. You actually will never be punished in an essay for ATAR English for using first person point of view. In fact, that is actually a really good way to establish authorial voice and show engagement. But some questions require it. This question requires it. If you are not talking about your response, and if I don't get a sense of your personal voice and your personal experience and your personal cultural and contemporary context, you really can't get more than a low C for this. Now the problem, of course, is what is your context? And there is some variety amongst different people. But let's look at the question again. Discuss how your response to values and attitudes in at least one text reflects a cultural and contemporary context. There will be slight shifts within the class, and that one you will have to account for yourself. But what I can tell you is that there are some commonalities. What you shouldn't do is just talk all the way through about I feel, I value. That's not going to help you. What you need to do is remember that you are part of a society. You're Australian. Or at very least, or live here. So the attitudes and values that you're responding to have a context. As a society, we say that we are egalitarian. Notice that I say we are. I don't necessarily say we are. This is about what we believe to be true, not necessarily what is consistently so. We value the idea that all people have equal or adequate access to the means of success. So, because of that, we actually do think that Thornhill should have the opportunity to have success, whether it be in England or in London or in Australia. We expect that he should, his children, himself, should have what they need to survive. And so when he makes a success out of his life and he looks after the future economic success of his children, that is something that we can respect. We can respect someone working hard. But in terms of the Aboriginal Australians, when we see them denied the opportunity for success and we see them prevented from receiving justice, because we are egalitarian, because we value the idea of everyone having equal opportunity, that appears to us to be unjust. And that's an example of how our cultural context and our contemporary context, where we began to look at the idea of Aboriginal Australians and their experience, influences our responses to the attitudes that we see in the text. When Smasher is speaking disparagingly about the Indigenous population, referring to them as thieves, violent, savage, when Thornhill takes their land, when he prevents them from having the corn they need to survive after he destroyed their crops, our attitude towards his attitude is that we are not on his side. We see his actions as unjust and unfair because the text has represented it as him preventing the Indigenous people having what they need to survive, what they need to be successful. That was a single, oops, it looks like there's a fight outside. Let's hope it doesn't get picked up by the video, in which case I would not be allowed to put the video up. So let's hope whatever the fight's happening over there stops quickly. All right, that's one example of how living in Australia and knowing about this influences the way we react to what we're seeing in the text and how they position us to see it. You might refer to this as the idea of the fair go. And if ever you were going to use this in an essay, which I wouldn't overly advise, but if you chose to, I would suggest you put it in inverted commas to show that you are using a cultural term that you are acknowledging is a colloquial term, but it's also, you know, pretty ubiquitous in Australian society. That means it's everywhere. The fair go, the concept of the fair go. We've always thought about the idea of the former convicts coming over and having the opportunity to start again, the opportunity to engage equally in society. That's always sat fairly well with our contemporary view of ourselves and contemporary view of what's right. But only recently have we started to actually apply that to Indigenous Australians and the idea that they have not got a fair go. So, are you okay, guys? Is your eyes hurting? Oh God, I was just going, is he down on the roll as having, like, you know, some sort of, I think it's vast allergy, and I was going, he isn't, like, that's not a problem, is it? Because I'm scared of having to use that little thing. Yeah, EpiPen. I know 100% that I'll inject myself, like, no doubt. All right. So what are some other, because we've looked there at our culture and the contemporary context, you might also want to look at things such as gender roles. So we know that we're in a patriarchal society, but that it has had the impact of feminism. I mean, the whole thing with Will Spence has brought it up. A whole lot of people saying two sides of things, depends upon what your attitudes are, with him slapping Chris Rock the other night. Some people say he was defending his wife and it was a good thing. Some people say violence is never okay. If you say it is a good thing, you're actually accepting patriarchal gender roles. The idea that a man is a defender of his family, that he is there to physically, spiritually lead them, and that women are defenceless and need defending, that women need leadership, that women need somebody with a firm hand to protect them against a dangerous world. Yes, that's it. So if you actually liked him smacking out Chris Rock, maybe you're not as feminist as you believe. So, but we are in a society. Yes, sorry.
Is this going to be on Saturday?
I'm hoping so. Yeah. Though I've noticed that it's going to be a bit like this when you go to actually do it. Really very good. Okay. So let's apply that to Secret River. The immense pressure that he feels, we understand. We understand that Sal comes from a time where she believes it is right for him to leave the family. Remember the construction, the representation of their rather awkward teasing about her being more powerful within the society because she is a free woman and he is a convict. And that they're clearly very uncomfortable with that change in their power dynamic. So our society understands it. But when he goes to strike her for not agreeing with him, when he lies to her, we start to think we don't actually go along with that. We don't approve of that. Why? We were all on board when he was defending his family against people that he perceived as being a threat, when he was prepared to work day and night to provide food for his family. Why, when he goes to hit his wife, and that's really just an extension of that, she is doing something that he considers a threat to the family. She is threatening to take his children away back to England, where they won't be as much of a social advantage as they are there. Why is him taking control of that situation repellent to us in our current cultural and contemporary perspective? Why? Why do you think, Thomas? Why can't we just slap a woman into line? You're not all good with that, are you? I'm going to move back a little bit. Johannes, why can't he just slap his wife into line and we go, yes, he's keeping his family in line?
Because of all the domestic violence things that happen in our current society.
Yeah. And we got more of a sense of the idea as women as people, women as with their own agency, women able to make decisions. Sal actually doesn't have that. It's a different cultural context, and we actually then begin to distance ourselves even further from Thornhill at that point because his attitudes and our attitudes are diverging. The readers, our context as Australians, in a society that has looked a great deal into the impact of domestic violence, we have more understanding of it now. We also understand that it is an exertion of power that is damaging. Just simply the idea that she should have agency and be able to make choices about her life without being smacked back into line. We feel differently about it. We also have a different understanding of Aboriginal Australians. Now, what is the attitude to Aboriginal Australians represented in the text? What do you think the attitude towards Aboriginal Australians is represented in the text?
Like, the colonists didn't like them?
Yeah, they certainly felt a great deal of hostility towards them. So we're talking specifically about both the military and civilian and convict, I should say, there was three of the groups. Their perspective of the Indigenous people is at best that they are a hindrance to the expansion of colonisation, the expansion of the empire, and, you know, weren't looked well upon. They were seen as a hindrance, and at worst as something that needed to be eradicated. Who represents the they need to be eradicated point of view? Smasher. And ultimately Thornhill. Yeah. And certainly the government, yes? Okay. Now, who represented the coexistence attitude? Blackwood. Does anyone present an attitude of this is their land and we should leave it?
Sal?
No. Sal. Nobody. That isn't presented. Of course, we also have the text representation, which is that the Indigenous people were the victims of the invasion of their country and the violence. So that's the text representation. Our concept has shifted. Do we believe in terra nullius? No. We don't. We understand that that was legal fraud, don't we? It was a declaration that was convenient, working on the assumption that because there was no paperwork, there was no records regarding ownership, because the Indigenous people were not a paper-based society, that meant that there was no way to challenge the ownership of the land. The land was considered to be vacant legally. We as a society have rejected that. We've had a number of situations in our society where legally we've rejected that. There was the Mabo court case where ownership of the land was recognised. We've done a lot with legislation regarding land rights. It's still quite tricky. We've had lots more to do with the reconciliation movement so that people understand now that there is continuous ownership of the land. So that representation of the Aboriginal people as simply existing on the land rather than actually having a civilization here, we've sort of shifted towards that. We understand that there was a civilization, there is a civilization, they still exist, the Noongar people still exist. Whose land are we on? Know their name? Starts with a W. Wajak Noongar, yeah, that's right. So that's the very fact that you actually, well, some of you, knew that we are on Wajak Noongar land, recognised that there has never been a treaty where they have ceded their sovereignty of their land. That is quite different perspective. Okay. That took a lot longer than I had intended, but hands up if you can see that your response to the values and attitudes in the text, your response reflects your cultural and contemporary context. Hands up if you can see that you're reacting because of who you are. You're reacting because you're Australian, because you're in the reconciliation era. You come from a society that does recognise patriarchal gender roles but does question them. It's 2022. You are young people. This is all why you are open to the idea of success for Thornhill. You are not open to the means by which he goes through it. You are repelled by the attitude of the British government and people like Smasher who take advantage of it. You are repelled by their predatory sexual approach to the Indigenous women. It's all part of that. Okay. Now that was the easy part, believe it or not. We're about to do the hard part now. I'm going to give you 2 more minutes to discuss that and get any information you think might be relevant ready for yourselves, and then we're going to do some writing activities. Get to work. You've got 2 minutes to get ready.